No prayers are spoken about it. No heretical cult chants its syllables in the dark. There are no forbidden tomes locked behind hexagrammic wards that fully describe it. In a galaxy drowning in blasphemy, corruption, and madness, this single ritual stands apart, not because it tempts, but because it ends. The Imperium fears chaos because it twists the soul. The Emperor fears this ritual because it leaves nothing left to twist. Long before the Golden Throne became a prison of eternal agony, before the Imperium learned to survive on ignorance and dogma, the Emperor issued a command unlike any other. It was not broadcast. It was not recorded in law. It was whispered directly into the minds of a handful of beings who no longer exist. The command was simple, absolute, and merciless: this knowledge must never survive. Not hidden, not contained, not studied. It was to be annihilated so completely that even the memory of its absence would fade. The decree carried no name. Names give things shape, and shape gives them endurance. Instead, it was identified only by its consequence. Entire data vaults across Terra went dark within hours. Astropathic choirs screamed themselves into silence mid-transmission. Scribes who had not yet understood what they were copying were found dead at their desks, blood vessels ruptured as though their thoughts themselves had been strangled. Some were executed. Others simply vanished, leaving behind rooms that felt thinner, as though reality itself had recoiled. The Emperor did not explain his reasoning. That alone terrified those who served closest to him. He was a being of clarity and intention, a mind that calculated futures with ruthless precision. When he acted without explanation, it meant explanation itself was a liability. The few who dared to question the purge were not accused of heresy. They were not imprisoned. They were quietly removed from existence, their genetic records sealed, their contributions retroactively attributed to others, their names scrubbed from history so thoroughly that even the warp failed to remember them. Fragments survived, as fragments always do. A redacted phrase carved into a melted cogitator core. A half-sentence preserved in a dying astropath's final nightmare. A recurring symbol that meant nothing on its own, yet inspired an instinctive dread in those who saw it. No two fragments ever aligned cleanly, as though the knowledge itself resisted reconstruction. Attempts to assemble them ended the same way: sudden silence, followed by absence. Not death. Absence. Even the Inquisition, that bloated engine of paranoia and control, possesses only myths. Inquisitors speak of it in sealed chambers with their voices lowered, despite knowing that silence offers no protection. Some believe it was a weapon. Others claim it was a contingency, a final measure against chaos itself. The oldest among them, those whose eyes have seen the Imperium rot for centuries, refuse to speculate at all. They know better. Speculation is how it begins. What unsettles the Imperium most is not what little is known, but when the command was given. It predates the Horus heresy. It predates the scattering of the Primarchs. It was issued during the height of the Emperor's power, when his vision for humanity burned brightest and most certain. At a time when he believed himself capable of shaping destiny, he encountered something he did not seek to control, only to erase. Those who were present felt it then, though none could name it. A momentary hesitation in the Emperor's psychic presence. A tightening, like a clenched fist around the future itself. For a being who did not fear death, betrayal, or oblivion, fear manifested in a far subtler way, through denial. This ritual did not threaten his life. It threatened his purpose. It did not challenge his authority. It rendered authority meaningless. Because this ritual does not corrupt. It does not dominate. It does not demand worship or sacrifice. It offers no power and no ascension. What it does instead is far worse. It removes the fundamental connection between existence and meaning. Not by violence, but by silence. A silence so complete that even the warp recoils from it, unable to reflect what no longer resonates. And so the Imperium learned its first lesson about the ritual it was never meant to remember. Some knowledge is not forbidden because it is evil, but because it is final. Stay with this story until the very end, because by the time you reach its final truth, you will understand why even knowing about this ritual changes how you see the Emperor, the Imperium, and the fate of humanity itself. The Emperor of mankind was not a creature of superstition. He did not fear symbols, omens, or whispered prophecies. He understood the warp, dissected belief as a tool, and bent entire civilizations to his will through reason sharpened into absolute certainty. Yet when this ritual surfaced, quietly, imperfectly, almost by accident, his response was immediate and extreme. Not investigation, not containment, obliteration. Because this was not something that could be ruled. It was something that unraveled rule itself. To understand why the Emperor feared it, one must first understand what fear means to a being like him. Fear was never about personal survival. He had died before. He would die again. Fear was not about losing Terra, nor the galaxy, nor even humanity's dominance. Those were variables, tragic but manageable. What he feared was a future in which the very struggle, the eternal conflict between order and chaos, belief and defiance, hope and despair, simply ceased to matter. This ritual did not behave like sorcery. It did not draw upon the warp. It did not summon demons or fracture reality in spectacular violence. It worked quietly, methodically, like a subtraction written into the fabric of existence. Where chaos fed on emotion, this ritual starved it. Where the warp echoed with thought and feeling, this ritual imposed stillness. Not peace. Stillness. The kind that follows when a soundproof door seals forever. The Emperor recognized something horrifying in that stillness. A universe without chaos was not automatically a victory. Chaos, for all its monstrosity, was proof that life still burned, still raged, still meant something. This ritual offered a cosmos where suffering ended because meaning itself was extinguished. A galaxy where gods starved not because they were defeated, but because nothing remained capable of believing, hating, desiring, or fearing. This was the revelation that forced the Emperor's hand. Humanity's survival had always been tied to its soul, to ambition, faith, defiance, and even contradiction. Remove that, and what remained might still walk, still speak, still build, but it would no longer strive. No destiny, no transcendence, no future worth defending, an empire of motion without purpose, enduring forever in a state of hollow continuation. And so the Emperor chose ignorance. Not for the masses, that was easy, but for himself as well. He fractured the knowledge deliberately, ensuring no single mind could ever hold the whole of it again. The ritual was not destroyed, because destruction implies engagement. Instead, it was denied. Starved of comprehension, buried beneath layers of forgetfulness enforced by death, silence, and fear. But denial is not the same as safety. Because knowledge does not always return through rebellion or heresy. Sometimes it resurfaces through desperation. In the Imperium, as it slowly bleeds itself across 10,000 years of endless war, is nothing if not desperate. Remember this as the story continues. Chaos wants to rule humanity. This ritual does not. It wants humanity to finish. And that is why the Emperor feared it more than any god. The Emperor never believed the ritual could be erased forever. He only believed it could be delayed long enough for humanity to outgrow the need for it. That was always his hope, that reason, unity, and purpose would one day make such final measures unthinkable. But hope, like all human constructs, decays under time. And as the Imperium aged, cracked, and ossified into something unrecognizable, the conditions that birthed the ritual began to quietly reassemble themselves. The first signs were not rebellions or heresies. They were anomalies. Entire populations reported as compliant, productive, and free of corruption, yet disturbingly quiet in the warp. Astropaths described these regions as thin, like listening through a wall that absorbed sound instead of transmitting it. Psychers complained of headaches, not from psychic overload, but from the absence of resonance. It was as if reality there refused to echo. Imperial authorities dismissed these reports as statistical noise. They always did. The Imperium was drowning in crises, and silence rarely screamed for attention. But there were others who noticed. Scholars buried deep within administratum data crypts. Mechanicus logicians who distrusted coincidence. Priests whose faith faltered when prayer returned empty. Individually, none of them understood what they were observing. Together, unknowingly, they were retracing the same steps humanity had once taken long before the Imperium existed. What made this resurgence truly dangerous was its purity. Chaos was not involved. No whispers from the warp guided these discoveries. No demonic visions offered power in exchange for obedience. This was reason, stripped of restraint and sharpened by despair. Loyal minds, seeking a solution not to conquer the galaxy, but to end the bleeding. The ritual began to reform not as a forbidden doctrine, but as an answer. Fragments surfaced again, not as texts, but as concepts. Mathematical voids where psychic influence should exist. Theoretical frameworks that explained how belief interacted with reality, and how that interaction could be severed. None of it was labeled heretical. In fact, much of it was praised. The Imperium rewards anything that promises stability, even if it does not understand the price. Somewhere deep within Terra, a sealed vault recorded a deviation so subtle it went unnoticed for decades. A single protocol flagged as non-essential. A precautionary safeguard quietly removed to improve efficiency. No alarms sounded. No inquisitorial fleets mobilized. The ritual did not need conspirators. It needed only time, logic, and a civilization desperate enough to accept a solution that required no faith. The Emperor felt it then, not as pain, but as distance. A faint receding pressure within the warp, like a tide pulling away from shore. For 10,000 years he had endured torment, sacrifice, and silence without flinching. But this was different. This was the sensation of being slowly forgotten by the universe he was meant to shepherd. He tried to warn them. Through dreams. Through fractured visions. Through subtle disruptions in the Astronomicon. But the Imperium had long since learned to ignore nuance. His messages were interpreted as malfunctions, relic instability, or divine mystery. The truth, that humanity was walking willingly toward a future without gods, without chaos, and without meaning, was too quiet to inspire fear. And so the ritual advanced, not as a single act, but as a convergence. Separate efforts, separate intentions, all aligning toward the same impossible conclusion. The Emperor had once stood at the center of history, shaping its flow through sheer will. Now he watched as inevitability formed beyond his reach. Because the most dangerous ritual ever conceived does not announce itself with fire and screaming. It arrives as relief. By the time anyone understood what was truly happening, the ritual no longer existed as a single design. It had become a pattern. A logic that spread through sanctioned research, doctrinal reforms, and emergency measures approved in the name of survival. No one called it a ritual anymore. That word implied intent. This was presented as optimization, as correction, as the natural next step for an empire too exhausted to keep believing in miracles. Entire departments within the administratum began reporting unprecedented efficiencies. Warp-related anomalies dropped. Astropathic messages passed with fewer distortions. Psychic backlash incidents declined. To a civilization battered by demonic incursions and endless war, these were miracles disguised as metrics. The cost, at first, seemed abstract, measured in things the Imperium had long stopped valuing. Faith dulled, not vanished, but thinned, like ink left too long in the sun. Priests noticed sermons required more effort to inspire the same fervor. Battle hymns rang hollow, their words spoken from memory rather than conviction. Even the Adepta Sororitas, paragons of belief made flesh, felt moments of inexplicable quiet where righteous fury should have burned brightest. The warp responded in kind. Demonic manifestations grew less frequent, but more unstable. Entities appeared malformed, incomplete, as though reality itself struggled to justify their presence. Chaos did not roar in defiance. It hesitated. And for the first time since the birth of the gods, hesitation spread among them like fear. This was when the oldest intelligences in the galaxy took notice. Eldar farseers screamed warnings into futures that refused to listen. Necron dynasties detected null zones expanding where even their ancient technologies failed to fully register existence. Orcs, creatures of pure belief and conflict, found certain battlefields inexplicably uninteresting. They left. No victory. No slaughter. Just departure. That alone should have terrified the Imperium. The Emperor understood the truth before anyone else could name it. The ritual did not destroy chaos. It invalidated it. By severing the connection between sentient life and the warp, it robbed the gods of nourishment without confronting them directly. No war. No rebellion. Just starvation. But the same blade cut deeper into humanity itself. Souls began to dim. Not extinguish, dim. Rebirth through the warp grew uncertain. The promise of martyrdom, ascension, or damnation weakened into ambiguity. Death became quieter. Too quiet. Those who died under the influence of the growing pattern did not scream into the Imperium. They slipped away without echo. To the Imperium, drowning in bodies, this seemed like mercy. To the Emperor, it was annihilation by gentleness. He strained against the golden throne, pouring what remained of his vast will into the Astronomicon. For a brief moment, the beacon flared brighter than it had in millennia. Across the galaxy, psychers collapsed. Navigators wept. And for a heartbeat, the pattern faltered. But inevitability does not require speed. Only direction. The ritual had reached a stage where stopping it would demand something the Imperium no longer possessed in abundance: sacrifice without certainty. To halt it would mean reintroducing suffering, instability, and chaos at a scale that would break worlds. To allow it to continue meant consigning existence to a future without gods, without meaning, and without the Emperor himself. And somewhere, deep within the machinery of Terra, a final convergence point began to form. Not a spell, not a chant, a choice. The Imperium did not recognize the moment it crossed the threshold. There was no alarm, no proclamation, no galaxy-shaking event to mark the transition. One day, the pattern was theory. The next, it was infrastructure. Entire systems were quietly reclassified under new psychic tolerance thresholds. New standards of acceptable resonance were introduced, framed as safeguards against demonic influence. Compliance was mandatory. Resistance was non-existent, because no one believed they were resisting anything at all. The ritual had completed its most dangerous transformation. It no longer required knowledge of its origin. It no longer needed intention. It had become policy. The hidden order the Emperor had once created, those whose sole duty was erasure, stirred from obscurity. For 10,000 years, they had watched, intervening only when fragments aligned too cleanly, when memories began to form shapes too familiar to ignore. They were not warriors, nor judges, nor priests. They were custodians of absence. Their task was never to win, only to prevent an ending. But this time, there was nothing to erase. No single archive held the truth. No heretical cult guarded forbidden rites. The knowledge was distributed, diluted, disguised as progress. Killing one mind solved nothing. Burning one world changed nothing. For the first time since their creation, the custodians faced a threat that could not be silenced without silencing the Imperium itself. They made their way to Terra. Within the Imperial Palace, beneath layers of sanctified machinery and decaying grandeur, the Golden Throne groaned under a weight it was never meant to bear alone. The Emperor's presence flickered, not in power, but in coherence. His thoughts, once vast and unified, fractured as the warp itself grew thin around him. He was becoming a god without a domain, a beacon shining into an ocean that was slowly drying up. In rare moments of clarity, he saw the future unfolding. Humanity would endure. It would spread. It would build. But it would do so without belief, without defiance, without transcendence. No saints. No monsters. No legends. An eternal empire of quiet function, where nothing truly mattered because nothing truly resonated. This was the fate he had feared more than extinction. The custodians reached the throne room and felt it immediately, the wrongness. Not corruption, not blasphemy, absence. The air itself felt unwilling to carry prayer. The emperor could not speak to them as he once had. His warnings came as impressions, as terror stripped of language. But they understood enough. The ritual had reached its final phase. To stop it now would require re-anchoring humanity to the warp, forcefully. Billions would die screaming, worlds would burn, chaos would surge back with apocalyptic violence. The Imperium would fracture, perhaps forever. But meaning would return, choice would return, the struggle would continue. To do nothing would be easier, quieter, kinder. The Emperor, bound and broken, was faced with the only decision he had ever truly feared. Not how humanity would survive, but what it would become if it did. And as the convergence point stabilized, the galaxy waited, not in dread, but in silence. The convergence did not announce itself with light or thunder. It manifested as certainty. Across the Imperium, systems aligned, calculations finalized, thresholds met, tolerances balanced. The ritual, now stripped of mysticism, reached completion through perfect compliance. Humanity had not been coerced. It had agreed. That was the cruel brilliance of it. No enemy could be blamed. No heretic could be executed. The Imperium had authored its own ending with the neat precision of bureaucracy. The Emperor felt the moment approach like a closing hand around his remaining presence. The warp around Terra thinned further, the astronomican dimming not from failure, but from irrelevance. A beacon is useless when there is nothing left that needs guidance. For the first time since his internment, the Emperor understood what true helplessness meant, not the inability to act, but the certainty that action itself might be the greater sin. The custodians stood in silence, awaiting a command that might never come. They were prepared to die. They were prepared to kill. What they were not prepared for was permission to end everything they had sworn to protect in order to save it. Loyalty had never demanded clarity before. Now it demanded judgment. In that narrowing instant, the Emperor did the one thing he had avoided since the dawn of the Imperium. He relinquished control. He did not issue an order. He did not impose his will. Instead, he fractured what remained of his consciousness and let it spill into the last place still capable of holding contradiction, the warp itself. Not as dominance, as confession, as warning, as sacrifice. The surge tore through the thinning immaterium like a dying star collapsing inward, reigniting resonance where silence had begun to take hold. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Across the galaxy, psychers ignited. Some burned out. Some ascended into screaming conduits of raw emotion. Warp storms blossomed like open wounds. Chaos howled back into relevance, enraged and starving, lashing out at a reality that had nearly abandoned it. The ritual shattered, not cleanly, but violently, its components tearing free from the structures that had sustained them. Trillions died. Worlds vanished beneath tides of madness and fire. The Imperium screamed as it always had, louder than ever, but this time with purpose restored. Faith returned, not as comfort, but as fury. Belief surged back into existence, raw and unfiltered, dragging meaning with it like a chain. The Emperor's presence dimmed to something fragile and distant. He had bought humanity continuation at the cost of certainty. The ritual was broken, but not erased. Its scars remained etched into reality, proof that silence had almost won. In the aftermath, the galaxy felt different. Quieter than before, but no longer empty. Chaos endured. Humanity endured. The struggle resumed. In deep beneath Terra, the Golden Throne creaked under a god who had finally learned what it meant to fear an ending worse than death. The Imperium rebuilt as it always had, on bones, faith, and selective memory. Official records named the catastrophe a convergence of warp instabilities, a divine trial endured through sacrifice and devotion. Monuments were raised, martyrs were counted. Entire sectors were written off as tragic but necessary losses in the endless war for survival. The truth, as ever, was buried beneath ceremony and scripture. But something fundamental had changed. The warp no longer surged with the same reckless excess it once had. Where storms had raged for centuries, there were now vast regions of uneasy calm. Not safety, never safety, but restraint. Demons manifested less frequently, yet with greater desperation, as though clinging to relevance in a universe that had briefly imagined life without them. The gods of chaos did not celebrate their survival. They remembered their near starvation. Humanity felt it too. Faith returned, but thinner. More fragile. Belief required effort now. Prayer still worked, but not automatically. Saints still rose, but fewer, their miracles narrower in scope. Souls echoed in the warp again, yet some vanished without trace, slipping into the same quiet that had almost claimed everything. The ritual had been interrupted, not undone. Its shadow lingered. The custodians of erasure disbanded without ceremony. Their final duty was not to destroy knowledge, but to watch. To listen for patterns forming again. They left behind no records, only warnings encoded into protocols that would activate if reality began to thin once more. A safeguard against an ending that could never be fully prevented, only postponed. The Emperor endured, bound to the throne, his consciousness reduced to a distant pressure rather than a guiding voice. He could no longer shape humanity's destiny. He could only suffer alongside it. In his silence was a final lesson he could no longer teach directly: survival without meaning is not salvation. And meaning, once questioned, can never be taken for granted again. Somewhere in the depths of the Imperium, new minds were already noticing the quiet. Already asking why certain systems felt different. Already measuring the warp not by its violence, but by its absence. They would not find forbidden texts or ancient rituals. They would find logic, efficiency, relief. And when they did, they would believe, once again, that they were saving humanity. Because the most dangerous idea ever conceived was never truly destroyed. It was only remembered too late. The warning signs returned slowly, almost politely, as if the galaxy itself hesitated to alarm those who had already suffered enough. No sector-wide catastrophes. No warp-spawned apocalypses. Just patterns, subtle, repeatable, and dangerously reasonable. Regions of space where psychic phenomena diminished year after year. Worlds where psychers were born weaker, quieter, easier to control. Administrators celebrated the numbers. Fewer possessions. Fewer burnings. Fewer screams. Stability, at last. What no one celebrated was what followed those improvements. Art lost its sharpness. Innovation slowed. Entire generations grew content to maintain rather than expand. Crusades met no resistance, not because the enemy was defeated, but because there was no will left to oppose them. Victories felt empty. Triumphs were recorded without joy. The Imperium had always been brutal, but it had never been apathetic. In the warp, something ancient began to move, not in anger, but in hunger. Chaos could not fully reclaim what had been taken, yet it sensed the same hollow spaces forming again. These were not wounds to exploit. They were voids that rejected intrusion entirely. Places where even a god could not exist. For the ruinous powers, this was terror. Not extinction by defeat, but irrelevance by absence. The Emperor perceived these developments dimly, like echoes reaching him through layers of numbness. His sacrifice had bought time, not immunity. He understood now. What he had once refused to accept, the ritual was not an invention. It was a consequence. When sentient life reaches a point where suffering outweighs meaning, silence becomes attractive. The Imperium was approaching that point again. Deep within forgotten archives and optimized systems, algorithms designed to reduce psychic instability began to converge. Not as doctrine, not as ritual, as best practice. The same logic that once assembled the ending was quietly aligning itself once more, guided not by malice but by exhaustion. No conclave was required this time. no secret cabal. The galaxy was simply tired. And so the final truth emerged, unspoken but undeniable: the ritual could never be permanently destroyed because it was born from despair. As long as humanity sought an end to suffering without understanding its cost, the silence would always find a way back. The Emperor waited, enduring the slow fate of resonance, knowing that one day humanity would stand before the same choice again: meaning or mercy, struggle or stillness. And next time, there might be no god left to be afraid of it. The Imperium, vast and sprawling, never truly rests. Wars rage across countless star systems, but the quiet threat grows not in battlefields but in the spaces between. In the silent corridors of power, in data vaults where red tape has replaced wisdom, in laboratories where reason itself is worshipped above consequence. The ritual, once a singular act of terrifying finality, had transformed into an idea that thrived quietly, logically, invisibly. Those who glimpsed its return felt unease but could not articulate it. Psychers whispered of a subtle thinning, where their power was not blocked, but diminished. Administrators noticed systems functioning too efficiently, as though the universe itself had optimized itself at the cost of unpredictability. Priests struggled to inspire devotion, sermons echoing faintly in hearts that no longer beat fully for belief. And all the while, the Emperor perceived this pattern, a shadow over existence that pulsed like a heartbeat, always just beyond his grasp. The galaxy's blind progress was playing into the ritual's hands. No heretic could claim it, no demon could twist it, no Xenos could infiltrate it. It spread as natural consequence, disguised as order. The same logic that once nearly silenced the cosmos now whispered through human systems, policies, and hearts. And when the Emperor reached out, he found that his influence was a faint static in a world increasingly tuned to ignore him. But even in this creeping inevitability, there were sparks of resistance. Small, stubborn traces of unpredictability, rebellious psychers, insurgent worlds, individual minds refusing to comply entirely. These were the only things keeping the ritual from completing its quiet conquest. Each spark was fragile, and each spark was precious. The Emperor knew that if they were snuffed out, if humanity truly accepted comfort over struggle, then the next emergence of the ritual might succeed beyond even his foresight. For now, it was a waiting game. A universe teetering between action and inertia, between meaning and nothingness. And the question hung over everything: if humanity willingly steps into silence, will even the Emperor's fear be enough to stop them? The stakes were simple and absolute. The ritual was no longer a threat from outside, it was a reflection of the choices humanity makes for itself. And as the galaxy drifted closer to that choice, the only certainty remained that some endings are patient, and some truths never die. N had left billions numb to pain and countless more blind to consequence. The Imperium's machinery, once a cathedral of purpose, now ran with precision that felt almost unnatural, as though each cog, each synapse, had been conditioned to avoid chaos, not because it feared it, but because it had forgotten how to engage with it. And in that silence, the ritual found fertile ground. The custodians of erasure, once vigilant and omnipresent, had receded into legend. Their sacred task of suppressing knowledge had been made obsolete by humanity's own exhaustion. Logic replaced instinct. Efficiency replaced curiosity. The seeds of the ritual no longer required interference. They were being sown willingly, by minds convinced that eliminating risk, pain, and unpredictability was the highest form of service. Even the warp felt the change. Where it once roared with the emotions, ambitions, and sins of billions, it now shivered faintly, a pale echo of what had been. Demons that lingered in the cracks of reality found themselves starved, their manifestations erratic, unstable, desperate. Chaos no longer had a battlefield, it had emptiness, and emptiness does not struggle. The Emperor, still bound to the Golden Throne, perceived it all like a tide slipping past his grasp. He understood that this was not conquest or rebellion, but quiet surrender, and surrender, once embraced, could be as lethal as annihilation. Humanity's brightest minds, unaware of the danger they were nurturing, devised new systems, new doctrines, new rituals, all ostensibly for order, for stability, for survival. Yet each act, each adjustment, each reform moved them closer to the pattern the ritual required. No one was malevolent, no one sought power, and that was what made it unstoppable. The ritual demanded not fear or worship, but compliance, willingly given, masked as progress. And in the midst of it all, the emperor remained vigilant, yet powerless to intervene directly. He had seen it before, the first attempt, long before the Imperium had formed, when humanity almost stepped fully into silence. The cost then had been staggering, but not final. This time, the consequences would be more subtle, insidious, and perhaps irreversible. Because the most dangerous thing about the ritual was not its violence. It was patience. It waited for the right moment, for the right conditions. In those conditions, the collective weariness, the desire for ease, the yearning for meaning without struggle, had begun to arrive, quietly, naturally, everywhere. The question now was no longer, can it be stopped? It was, will humanity choose to stop it before it chooses for them? By this time, the subtle currents of the ritual had woven themselves into the very structure of the Imperium. Decisions once made for courage or ambition were now made for efficiency. Planets were stabilized not through devotion or struggle, but through procedures that stripped conflict of meaning. Bureaucracy had become the new arbiter of destiny, and the galaxy moved forward with mechanical obedience, blind to the hollowness creeping into its foundations. The Emperor felt the consequences acutely, as though a shadow of every soul in the galaxy was being measured, and each one was found wanting. Even the custodes, those tireless sentinels of the throne, sensed the shift. They patrolled halls filled with perfection, yet found no joy in it. The purity they maintained was not triumph, but silence. Silence that, to the keenest perception, carried the weight of inevitability. What terrified the Emperor most was not that humanity could fail. He had seen countless failures, but that it might succeed at the wrong cost. The ritual did not promise death. It promised endurance, not as a living, striving civilization, but as one that simply continued. Struggle, passion, aspiration, these were all optional now. The galaxy could function perfectly, yet the very essence of life risked being hollowed out. Elsewhere, psychers began noticing anomalies in the warp, not storms, not tears, but absences. Areas where psychic resonance should have surged now whispered instead. The warp, starved of meaning, was no longer a chaotic sea but a near flat plain, calm yet unnervingly empty. Some psychers, unprepared for the sensation, collapsed entirely, their minds unable to reconcile the silence with the expectations of their perception. Even the ruinous powers recognized it. For the first time, they did not rage or scheme, they hesitated. The ritual was not destruction by their hands. It did not burn worlds or sunder reality. It merely demanded that life exist in a state where their influence was irrelevant. Hunger, not annihilation. Starvation, not combat. And for entities that fed on emotion, faith, and struggle, irrelevance was the cruelest torment imaginable. The Emperor's thoughts flickered across the galaxy in fleeting bursts of awareness. He understood that the next phase would not come from enemies, heretics, or traitors, but from the very people he had devoted millennia to guiding. Humanity, in its pursuit of comfort, efficiency, and the illusion of stability, was unknowingly reshaping reality to complete the ritual's design. And so the waiting began again, not a pause, but a vigilance, the silent awareness that history has a pattern, and that the most dangerous forces do not always shout. Some wait, quiet, inexorable, and when they act, nothing survives the inevitability. The Imperium endured, as it always had, but it was not unchanged. The cost of the ritual's near completion left its mark, not in ruins or corpses, but in resonance, in the very soul of humanity. Systems hummed efficiently, populations obeyed instinctively, psychers reported fewer disturbances, and war continued, yet a subtle hollowness threaded through every victory, every triumph, every prayer. The galaxy lived, but it was a life stripped of the brilliance, chaos, and defiance that once gave it meaning. The Emperor remained upon the golden throne, a silent observer of a universe that had survived only through his sacrifice and the terror of what nearly came to pass. He had halted the ritual, but not destroyed it. Its logic, its consequence, its patient inevitability persisted, waiting for humanity's exhaustion to open the door again. Every act of convenience, every pursuit of comfort, every surrender to efficiency nudged the galaxy closer to the threshold it had nearly crossed before. Yet even in the quiet aftermath, there remained sparks of rebellion against inevitability. A single mind questioning the rules, a single soul daring to feel more deeply than required, a single heart refusing to obey the pattern. These fragile anomalies kept the universe tethered to possibility. The ritual could wait, but it could not act without consent. And consent, even in its absence, still flickered in unpredictable ways. The Emperor understood the truth of all this, and it weighed upon him more heavily than any war, any betrayal, or any death he had endured. Some endings are patient. Some forces endure not because they are powerful, but because they are inevitable when conditions allow. And some truths are never fully erased, lingering like shadows even when the light of survival burns brightest. Humanity continues to struggle. The Imperium continues to endure. The warp continues to simmer with possibility. And somewhere, in the patterns that guide the fate of stars and souls, the ritual waits, patient, persistent, inevitable. Its shadow will always exist for those who look too closely, for those who dare to measure the cost of comfort, peace, and survival. The galaxy will fight, and it will survive, but the memory of the silence, the faint echo of what might yet come, will never fade entirely. Some endings do not shout. Some endings wait quietly, until the moment the universe forgets it should resist. And the Emperor, even bound to his throne, he knows it is only a matter of time before humanity faces the choice again. To struggle, to feel, to live fully, or to yield quietly to the inevitable.